educate Mexicans, to educate North Africans, to educate Egyptians about the danger of anti-Semitism and the connection between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. So that's the first document. Then, as I started doing more research, I was interested in how ideas of anti-Semitism and racism gets translated through visuals, and what is the impact and the objective behind that. Then I was able to find another series of documents by Kimon Ivan Morengo, or he goes by the name of Kim. And Kim was a cartoonist who was born to Greek parents in Alexandria, Egypt. And he was basically writing for a lot of newspapers, not only in Egypt, but later on in France and the UK. And he has a series called Adolf and his donkey Benito and his socialist. Adolf Wahimaru Pinto Washuratao. And this series really also, it's in a way it's about humor, but also about caricaturing the Nazi leadership. So that's on one level. Then you get to another series of visuals again, but these were done within the camps in France, in Camp Bourse and Camp Le Vernet. And this is by Rosenthal, happens to be a German Jew who fled in the middle of the 1930s as the Nazis emerged to power, and then he would find a job, a career in France where he was drawing, but then he would later on be picked up by the Vichy, and then interned in Camp Bourse. And then unfortunately he didn't survive the war. He died in Auschwitz, but his drawing survived the war. So this is all in between 1936 and 1945. This is still, we're talking about the period of the war. I think the best, for me, one of the most interesting work was done in France, 1943-44, published in 1945. This is a very interesting work that actually reminds us of Art Spiegelman, of Maus. And actually, what you think about it, Maus is to some extent draws the way of drawing, even though it's different from the work of Edmond François Calvo. You can see another images here. La Bête est morte. This is in two series called Quand la Bête est morte et La Bête Quand la Bête est déchaînée et La Bête est morte. So this is all about the war, but told through stories of animals. Yeah, the same thing here. And then you can think about, as I said, if you read Art Spiegelman's work, you can see that. The only graphic novel we have, or graphic history we have about the relationship between North Africa and Europe is this one titled La Carte Jaune, which is basically, it represents the story of Victor Young Perez, who is a Tunisian Jew, a boxer, world champion, who died in Auschwitz, who was killed in Auschwitz. So that's one. And then you have also a children's book about the Grand Mosque of Paris. Whether there is a whole, but this is the. So we don't have, why in general we don't have a lot of comics and bande dessinée that try to translate the war and the genocide from a North African perspective. And this is where Najib and I come into the picture. So we decided in 2016, I reached out to Najib. So who is Najib? Najib is a comic artist who was part of the second generation of Algerian comic artists. In the 1960s, 1969, you have an emergence of Algerian artists who launched a campaign or a movement of bande dessinée that includes artists, very famous name like Slim, very famous not only in Algeria, but also in France and the United States. And then you have these artists, what they did, they launched one of the first journal that dealt with comics, and satire of social and economic issues in Algeria, called be dished both in French and Arabic. This wouldn't survive for a long time. Survives probably until the late 1970s, but then because of the state bans, and so it will keep coming back and forth. But overall, you do have a strong tradition of comics in Algeria. Okay, so Najib represents what I call the second generation that emerged in mostly in the 1980s. He worked for newspapers in Algeria. He was also part of the launching different festivals of bande dessinée in Tunisia as well as in Algeria. And lastly, before he moved to France and then the United States, he was part of a group of artists that were targeted by the Islamists in the 1990s. Actually, some of his friends were killed during the Civil War, the 1990s Civil War. So what is the connection between how this Najib connects to the Holocaust? And I want to stress 2 points here why Najib's work is important. First of all, this is by chance, or we call it a stroke of chance. Najib was an artist who spent some time in Morocco in the late 1990s because he's married to an anthropologist who did research in Morocco. And also, she's also a daughter and granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor. So he's married to a Holocaust, a daughter of a Holocaust survivor, both as a granddaughter and the daughter. And he was also involved in talking as well as collaborating with bande dessinée artists in Morocco, especially this one called On a femme bien les rats, which was a bande dessinée written by a political dissident during the years of Rabb, during the reign of King Hassan II, and by the name of Abdelaziz Maurice. And so these are drawings in prison, and it's actually Najib who did the cover in 2000 for this book. And then you can see here a letter from Abdelaziz Maurice, who died around 2010, to Najib. So overall, I was in some way lucky to collaborate with somebody who has an understanding of Judaism, who understand also Holocaust history, who understand the context of North Africa, and also who is familiar with the Nazi genocide. So with that background in mind, I want to take you now to what is the topic of this. So the project is literally about camps. There's so much that has been written about camps. The Gumbos work on camps. In the European side, we have a literature about camps during the World War II in the American context, the internment of Japanese Americans. We have different descriptions and work on camps, but we don't have a lot that really, even though it's from a visual and artistic and a bande dessinée perspective on camps in North Africa. And so there is the idea here is to how to capture all the history of Vichy camps in North Africa through the visual. And before we do that, before I opted to do this, I wanted to first of all to locate these camps and see the geography of these camps. So this is an image of a remains of one of the camps called the camp of Tendrara in northeast Morocco. This is one of the areas where you can still see traces of buildings. You can see here France. You can see these are the Marseille. You can see all these elements that they are. Then you can also see the remains of the railroad system. So what do these railroad systems mean? These are railroad systems that were built mostly to connect mines all across the desert. So the French had a project to connect. The French had a project to connect the Mediterranean region especially areas like Oran, cities of Oran, cities of Algiers, and other cities on the Atlantic, to the desert, to the Sahara, called Mer Niger, and then also connected to West Africa. Actually, Jenny here did a lot of work on that. So in a sense here, looking at these remains and these artifacts and the landscape also was part of thinking about how this project should be conceptualized. So these are this is, for instance, a camp. This is the railroads that connects to one of the coal mines, one of the most important coal mines in the region of Boarfa. It's actually the first one that the French Vichy government started using. And then also you have this whole region was also rich in manganese, in cobalt, in iron. All of these were central or important resources, not only for the Vichy industry, but also for the Nazi industry. This is one of the few buildings that are actually still standing up to now. This is a camp of Tendrara. Of course, I'm going to talk a little bit later about who was running these camps before I start talking about the art and the project itself. But this is one of the few camps that was managed by German officers during the early 1940s. So let me explain first what is the arguments behind this project. So first of all, this is about, as I said, camps that were set up in a colonial geography, where refugees were central to this geography of internment. So the idea that you have refugees, two waves of refugees coming in the early 1930s, mid 1930s, from fleeing Germany and other European countries, and then ended up mostly in France because they thought that's the safest place. And then you have, at the same time, at the end of the 1930s, you have another wave of refugees coming from moving at the end of the Spanish Civil War in 1939 and ending in places like Marseille and areas like close to Gurs and Louverné, which were, before they became internment camps, they were actually refugee camps. So you can see a flow of two waves of refugees. And then the ones who start thinking about had a clear idea about what the Nazi rise meant to Jews and sometimes non-Jews, is they decided to go to North Africa, mostly to Casablanca. And that's because that was the only way to exit to the Americas. If they couldn't do that, they would go to Lisbon, to Portugal. That's another route. So you have two places where you can leave, either Lisbon or Casablanca. Now, the refugees who couldn't leave, they will be picked up by Vichy and then in turn taken to camps. And why? Because that represents a free labor. To build a project like this big railroad system that connects the Mediterranean to the Sahara, you need labor. You need indigenous labor and foreign labor. This foreign labor can include Jews, also can include Spanish Republicans. So this is not something that so you would say, why this? How do we come to this project? So I've been working on the connection between the Holocaust and North Africa, World War II and North Africa for the last 12 or 13 years. And one of the things I was thinking about is, in addition to collaborating with colleagues at UCLA and outside of UCLA, is to think about ways to translate this knowledge to new generations. So I think, and this is my perspective, I might be wrong, I think Holocaust studies is entering a moment of crisis. And it's a crisis that has to do with how you write about the Holocaust for future generations. And at the moment we're now today thinking about the people who were killed during the Nazi genocide, I think in addition to having the memories of the people who survived be part of the story, I think it's also the universities and high school and K through 12 has an obligation to think about ways to communicate, to think about the genocide, to teach the genocide, to all of these, I think, are part of the story. And that's where I come from as a Muslim who is thinking about it from the North African region. So in a sense, the first project included writing encyclopedic entries of all of these camps that are all over North Africa. The second project, which actually have some colleagues here that were part of it, was to based on a conference that we did at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and later on at UCLA, was theoretically think about this. But then the last part of this project was to actually take stories of people who survived or lived during the war and write it and translate all these stories in English so that you tell these stories not only from a theoretical, methodological perspective, but also just as stories, because through stories you educate. And then that's the reason why when we get to the comic is just one iteration of how you translate this knowledge. And so it began, the translation of this knowledge began, is it somehow influenced, as I said, by Agamben's work on the camp. But Agamben was talking about a different camp in the context of Nazi Germany. I think the North African camps that I'm talking about here are a totally different story, and that's what I will try to lay out here. So it begins, just if you go and look at empires, and if you think about empires, not only the British Empire, but the French Empire, railroad systems and transportation and roads are important to control, means of controlling and linking. And one of them here, you can see here the railroad system that they've been talking about that connects the Mediterranean to Sub-Saharan Africa, and then from there it will connect it to Dakar. That's the project that the French have in mind since the middle of the 19th century. But this project was never achieved because there was a disagreement between the military leadership and colonial leadership, whether they should go with paved road or they should go with the railroad system. And then they were able to build certain phases of it or certain sections of it that go all the way to close to, I would say, Colombia Shah, right in the middle there. And then they had another project to connect actually Morocco to Dakar, but bypass this, what we call Spanish Sahara, and then have another, what we call the Western railroad system. This was never also achieved. So the reason why most of it has to do with finding labor, which is basically become the central part of the project. What do you mean by finding labor? So there are two things. When Pétain, who the government of Pétain, who took over after the Nazi occupation of France, the whole Pétain's idea of the French state and the French society is built on these principles: the principle of family, work, and nation. And so there are people who would not fit in this project. These are what's called the undesirables. And these undesirables, you have two things that they could include: the communists, Jews, all kind of groups. So, and then, but the key, another principle of this idea, the Pétainist idea, builds on also the soil and land. So we link in citizenship and nationhood to the idea of whether you can make use of the French land. So if you don't fit in this model, what happens to you is that part of what happens is that a lot of people have been moved, just like animals, from one part of the Mediterranean, Marseille, to another part of the Mediterranean, Algiers or Oran, or certain areas in Morocco. So And so this project of beginning to move people from the French soil, because they don't fit there, to North Africa, this is being captured, for instance, in this drawing by one of the internees at Camp Jelfa. This is actually one of the few drawings that survived the war, because one of the elements that French had in mind is that, or the Vichy government had in mind, that it's rarely where you find actually notes or books that were left by the internees, because the French they based their argument of maintaining the secrecy over these camps through either the means of building camps in desert, so it's easy to erase, and building camps in forest. That's why Camp Gours and Camp Le Vernet, those are using nature in some ways to maintain or to eliminate any forms of memory and memorialization, which I'll talk about later. So in this case here, you see an example of, these are names of real people who were taken, for instance, in this drawing, in this case. So you can see people are from Armenia, Iran, Poland, Turkey, Romania, Russia, Hungary, Poland, and Germany. And you can see the reasons why they were sent to Camp Jelfa.
How come Iran, may I ask? How does Iran fit the other countries?
Because these are part of the refugees who were in Europe, in Algeria. So sorry, in Europe before they were taken, mostly in France. Yeah. So you can also, you don't see a lot of, sometimes if you look at other records, you have people from North Africa, from Morocco, for instance, Algeria, and some of them actually died in Auschwitz too. Jews, and very few, not a lot of Muslims, but you have names of 2 or 3 Muslims, but you definitely have Jews. The other things in terms of writing, so in terms of certain forms of memory, in terms of writing, unlike Europe, where you have a lot of memoirs and biographies of these camps, we don't have a lot of, as far as these North African camps. We have some of the documents we base our comic on are these 2 documents. There is a memoir written by an Algerian nationalist by the name of Mohammed Ariski Barkani, so these are in camps of concentration camp, but also a disciplinary camp. And then Max Ob work on Jelfa. And Max Ob is probably the most important author who has written about the camps in Algeria. He is a Spanish, he survived the camps. He ended up in Mexico City, where he became one of the key figures of art, not only as a playwright, but also as an artist and as a writer in Mexico. And he writes mostly in Spanish, although some of his works are translated into French. The other things that we're looking for, as far as I'm still walking you through the documentation, because then this project is about making the archives speak like an ethnographic document. So the other things we looked at is what kind of writing and Islamic or Arabic writing about anti-Semitism existed in this archive. So we were able to find 2 documents. This is one is written by an Iraqi who made it to this archive of the Lika. It was also in 1940, called Islamic Traditions and Nazi Principles. Do they agree? Scientific, social, political, and religious research. So you say, why is this important? Because what was happening is that most of these thinkers who were writing, they have seen a connection between Islamophobia and anti-Semitism during this period of the war. Okay. That's the reason why you have an engagement with what do you call chapters that are fighting anti-Semitism at that time. And then you have another one by Hamid al-Maliji. It's called Revelations of the Theory of Supremacy of Certain Races and the Place of North Africans in this Theory. This was written again in late 1930s, and it's a reaction to anthropologists, German anthropologists, and then the racial discourse, not only towards Jews, but also towards Africans. So this is as when you think about when you're looking at what has been done and finished as far as the final railroad system that connects Mer, Niger, that connects Oran to the camp, always close to Sidi Bel Abbas, but was mostly in Abadla. This is what the French were able to finish. They were also able to connect some areas with the coastlines in Morocco, in Spanish Morocco. But most of the project literally starts from Oran and then it ends at Abadla. Now, before I get to the actual project and how we were able to do it, I'm going to talk a little bit about the idea of forced labor, and not only among Jews and Spanish Republicans who will come later in the late 1930s, but the forced labor was a principle of the French colonial project that used indigenous population in clearing roads, not only for railroads, but also for what we call the piste or dirt road, as early as the 1920s. They were also using Senegalese soldiers. They were using Senegalese soldiers that were part of the French colonial army. This is a picture in southern Morocco that was taken during the early 1930s, where you see Senegalese tirailleurs of the region called the region of Marrakesh, and what is that, clearing the road to just as the French were about to take over an area in the Anti-Atlas Mountains. And then the last image here deals with one of the reason why I'm showing this for two reasons: one personal and one that has to do with the Nazi project. This is a labor camp. This is called the cobalt mine of Bouazet in southeastern Morocco in mid-1930s. And this cobalt mine, it's one of the first projects that the Nazis were already interested in as early as 1935. Why? And because of the importance of cobalt for the industry, for the German industry at the time. So you have this, you do see that this was one of the few images that survived the German consulate of Casablanca, because all the material we have of the German consulate of Casablanca was burned. And then this was led by the consul Aomar, who was interested, who was basically delegated to make sure that the Germans had expand their network of figure out where the different locations of the mines are all over Morocco. That's number one. And then number two, you can see here in this image, this was these are images that I got from a family archive in the city of Borzizet. You can see that most of these women there these are local tribal women as well as men. The personal part of this is one why I think I've been interested in this, doing a project like this and then expanding projects similar to this, is that I've done about 120 interviews with my dad, and he talks about this camp, and he served in this camp in the mid-1930s as a laborer, as a day laborer. So these are the big picture of all of the camps. So you have three categories of camps. You have labor camps. This is the majority of camps were labor camps. You have detention camps, what we call the camp de triage. You basically bring people, but once people land, if this is a second iteration of the second phase of the migration, when people arrive to Casablanca, you take them, and the French Vichy authorities would take them, and then they would send them to camps like Sidi El Yeshi, right there, right in the mid Casablanca. That's a camp de triage. And then because with families, and then once you have, then you send people, you make sure that people are sent. If you have able bodies, people who can work in the camp, then you would send them to camps like as far as the northeastern part, as far as Bergen, as far as Oran, as far as Marrakesh, and so on and so on. Okay, and then you have some other camps that actually you talked about here in this area of West Africa, and most of the people here were from as sailors, sometimes from Scandinavia and other parts of Europe. Okay, so the last point I want to stress here before I walk you through how this project and why it's about memorialization of the Holocaust. Why and what it helped. How does a comic written by that has an ethnographic as well as a historical perspective allow us to memorialize the Holocaust as an educational purpose? So as I already talked about the importance of the leak archives for this project, all of the data that I'm using in the book is based on historical archives. I don't invent anything. Every box or every panel that you would see in the graphic novel is backed up by historical documents. Okay? So, and then the majority of the documents, over 20%, 90% of the documents come from the leak archive. So this is, for instance, so the just like as I start with the first book that highlights the stories of taken excerpt from Mein Kampf, translating them into Egyptian dialect, and then having drawings of them. We have also similar booklets that survived the war, and we found one by Koster, and this document was received by Donald Koster when he served for the American Army in an early 1940s. So he basically talks about the story of what a normal story of every refugee who fled Europe or fled northern part of the Mediterranean and ended up in Morocco or Algeria. Then you get the picture, you get picked up in Marseille, you're put in a boat, and then you're sent for hard work. And then this is the few images we have. This is one example of a camp, of a labor camp. This is the camp of Yelfa. Okay. And for instance, Max Ob talks a lot about dogs talks about animals, talks about the humiliation, all of these stories that we, and this is another image. Okay. This is what we don't have a lot of images of the camp. And as I mentioned, there is a reason behind that. It's about erasure, natural erasure, but also a human erasure that was instituted by the bureaucracy of the war during the Vichy period. So to undo that and to bring the memory back, this is how this project starts. So we thought about the following characters. We had Najib has a different style of drawing. You could take the book, you could take the page, and you could see a lot of blank. I made sure that we don't do that. Can I borrow the book? Yes, of course. So I made sure that we don't do that. I made sure that this is the anthropological part of it. I made sure that you don't have no space for everything. Every space is covered by details that reflect the memory, that reflect the emotions. This is what I call a thick description in every panel. Yeah. So this is what I call a thick description in every panel. So what you have, the Hans, about 70% of the story is a story of Hans. That's a real story. Then there are things that you want to have the arc of the narrative that starts from Berlin and Munich and ends all the way to France, and from France, North Africa. You want to pack it. So the other 30% of the Hans story, we had to use other stories of other real refugees to add to what's missing. That's what we call composite. So we made sure that you have these different memories, different stories brought together to make sure that you have what we call a composite story of different stories that allow us to remember and to think about all of these. So then somebody would say, why Hans Frank? Hans Frank is not a good name in Holocaust history. He's a perpetrator. So because we chose Hans, because that's the most important, the dominant name in the archive. It represents a lot of Germans during that. But we added some elements to it, Frank, on purpose to also think about the perpetrators. And then Frank is also the stories of Anne Frank. So all of these elements, we made sure that we tie all of these elements to make sure that you're telling the story from a North African perspective, but at the same time, you're linking it to other European memories. So Hans is a journalist who grew up in Munich, in Berlin, Munich. His father is Joseph, and his father served in World War I. One quote, what it means, how do you become the idea of German, are you German Jew? This whole debate about debate that would take over during the interwar period. And then Johannes is the communist. Makhlouf ben Nassim is the Algerian Jew, who represent all the North African Jews. Yusuf is the West African Senegalese tirailleur. Julio is the Spanish Republican. Mohand is the North African Amazigh, and the French captain represent the system, no name. And you can see that there is a reason why, because we made sure that it represents the whole system. So this is what I mean about packing. You pack the panel to reflect the ethnographic part. So it requires a lot of work. So every detail. So we have. So Najib would comment. I would write 12 pages, and he would come. I said, I don't want 12 pages. I want one paragraph. And then you let me, and then we discuss over coffee. We happen to be neighbors, so sometimes we meet for 5-6 times a week, and then we talk about all of the conversation was about what you can add to make sure that you're allowing the archives to speak ethnographically. Okay? They're allowing the. So that's, and then you can see evidence. So you can see elements. You can see here that reflect the Jewishness of the family. And the other thing we try to do, because we don't want to give a visibility to the perpetrators and to the mastermind of the genocide, Goebbels and Hitler and so on and so forth, but we're allowing them to have a conversation or be part of the family conversation between the father and the son. So you can see what we're doing, we're using the radio, for instance. So through the radio, we allow the speech of hate to be in conversation with the daily encounters between the father and the son. Okay. And then from there, you get to, this is the arc narrative. So as I said, I've written about this conversation that goes between both sides of the Mediterranean. I'm thinking about the Mediterranean as a space where it's of encounter, but also of limitations. And when you think about it, you have to have a circulation as people move from one side of the Mediterranean to another. France, Spain, Morocco, Algeria, these are all the spaces where people have moved around, especially in the interwar period and the war period. So Paris becomes a central place. And then we talk about Paris not only as a place where you have refugees from the northern part, from Germany, from Poland and other places coming, but you have also Paris is a place where Makhlouf ben Nassim is coming also. Because here you have a lot of Algerian Jews who were struggling with the emergence of anti-Semitism in places like Constantine and Oran and other places. They decided, well, probably France is the best option in as early as the early 1930s. Yeah. But that was not the case here, because Makhlouf, for instance, gets there and then he faces a different story of a similar but different form of racism. And then the other thing you can see here, Le Matin, le statut des Juifs promulgué. What we've done is that there are 3 layers that are central to this work to make it ethnographically relevant. The first one is the dialogue. the balloons, for instance, that dialogue comes from the archive. But also we had another element which called you take the documents that existed in the archive and you redraw them to give an immediacy to the event. So that's why you have sometimes what we do, we use actual documents from the archives, like this one, for instance, the Nouvelle. So we have images that are actually from the archive. And then the last point, and because I'll leave some time for Q&A, the last point I want to talk about here is the most important, I would say the most important part of this project, which is to think about the camp. How do you give a different story? How you write a story of these camps that are different from what happened in Europe through this project. So if you can look here, this is you can see the camp, but also not far from the camp, you have, these are refugees or internees who later on become prisoners being moved through a village in this town. And this is actually the story of all of the camps. Most of these camps are placed in either cities or not far from cities, not far from villages. And then that's also tells, so how do people talk about this? Whether people still remember this or not. In some areas they do, in some other areas up to today, now. So we tried also to highlight that, this idea of why people are not talking about and how people remember some of these camps today. And then we go on and then we talk about Jewish communities that were living close to some of these camps. Okay, so the Jewish community of Jaffa, for instance, here we have reports from the archives where rabbis, for instance, were some members of the Jewish communities and Muslim community were aware of it. So this is the one we try to describe this. And then last but not least, we bring in the story of West Africans, okay, which doesn't get a lot of space in not only French graphic comics, although it's more and more being now talked about, but also in World War II comics in general. So, and then we tell the story of this not only from what happened to a lot of Senegalese tirailleurs and Black soldiers who served in the French army during World War II, and then how many of them were killed by the Nazis. We have the example of Leon, for instance, here, but also we tell a story of a descendant of a Senegalese tirailleur also who served in World War I, and then now serving in World War II, but then he resisted. So this is one case that we found in one of the archives. And then, so this Yuso becomes one example of Senegalese tirailleurs who sometimes rejected the policies of the colonial administrators because most of the time when we talk about the camps, there is always a description of Senegalese tirailleurs are siding with the bad, with the colonial government. So that's something that we also try to, in a sense, to give to look at it from a different lens here. So what is, to conclude, there are two things I want to stress here. There is this question of how do you think about this chapter of World War history in the context of North Africa, and through what lenses can you approach it? Do you approach it mostly through the Jewish case? In this case here, we have these memorials that are of Jewish workers, Tunisian Jewish workers who were killed during the Nazi occupation of Tunisia for 6 months between 1942 and 1943. So this is one case. Do we also approach it mostly through the North African Jews who survived the war, or North African, or memories of North African Jews who were killed in Europe Or do you approach it through a set of stories of different undesirables? My approach is that I think to instill a new wave of rethinking about Holocaust studies is that you have to bring a lot of stories from different national schools. And I think that's where you begin the process, not only of memory, but also you begin the process of memorialization. And this very humble work that is one element of it is part of memorializing the Holocaust, but it's a memorialization that has to go through the K through 12. To go through K through 12, high school, middle school. I believe if we don't do that, we're pouring water on sand. Because I think that we're thinking of it's a different generation, a different perspective, it's a different long durée. It's the history is, there are other players, the other layers that are involved in this. And think about the Palestine, Israel, all these conflicts, you can see about different things at different levels. But I think it has to include different views so that you can at least push people to think about their historical framework, not to undermine the importance and the centrality and of the genocide as it is, but to have different people coming from their own histories to really have an interest in it, to listen. You cannot remember and memorialize without listening. And I think the listening starts with these projects, and that's why you have to have a partnership between scholars of the Holocaust and teachers of the Holocaust, not at the university level only, but at the K through 12 level. And that's why I'm partnering with people at the state of Arizona. I have people who are I've been working with educators at the state of Arizona, even at the time where in America now they are banning books and taking books from libraries, including Frank's. But also looking at it in Morocco. And this is translated, this is gonna come out in Arabic and French in June. And it's a project that I'm working with partners in Morocco to hopefully make it part of the curriculum. It's gonna take time, but it's part of the project. And I think that's the only way we could do justice to history. And at least, and by doing justice to history, you think about it not only through monuments, but also one day, once that becomes part of thinking and remembering these through these different national histories, different national memories, I think we'll get to the stage of having a memorial like this, hopefully, in front of the port of Casablanca. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was fascinating. Sorry that I had to step out for a minute for an administrative thing. But I would like to open the floor for questions from the audience. So, who would like to start?
Yes.
Well, thank you very much. I'm a doctor of Jew from Algeria, and it's very moving from stories. Now, I just one question. It's black and white.
Yeah.
And I would like to know if it's in colors or.
That's a great question. We did discuss whether we should have it in colors, and we opted for black and white because of it allows us the black and white and those shades. You can see there are a lot of shades. Those allow us to really think about the emotions, the struggles of refugees. So colors the color, I think, with when we talked about it, Najib is he knows the tradition, the French tradition. He knew the European tradition, the American tradition. And then when we had all these conversations, we opted that black and white is the perfect style to communicate and to translate this story through these visuals.
It's strong.
Yeah. No, he was incredible. No, it's really this is somebody who. Okay. I think this was meant to be. This project was meant. Because here you have somebody, probably one of the best, I think he's one of the best North African artists that ever existed. I really believe that. And I've done a lot of research on comics but he's also somebody who's very shy. So he hasn't produced, when I started asking people and looking for publishers, they're looking, but he doesn't have he's not over the internet. This is the way how we think about the world these days, about how many likes you have and all this. So he's not, but then I started showing them their work, his work. That has never been published. And they couldn't believe it. They said, why is this guy not publishing his stuff? And I can't speak about that. That's Najib. He loved France. I don't know why. He loved Paris. He loved Paris. Everything for him is all about Paris. His wife and I. So, but also you tell him something. I couldn't have done this project with another person. I hired a student and a university artist from Tetuan, great artist. But he didn't have that knowledge of France, North Africa, Holocaust, Europe. He didn't have that. So he started drawing some pages for me, and they're just not there. So I had to cancel the contract, and then I had to go with it. So that's it. I just want to. I had to pause here just to mention how special this person was, and we were doing this as he was going through a chemo. Pancreatic cancer. It's not easy. 8 years. It's very. And I'm sorry if I'm going to use some bad words here, but one time I asked him. He said he saw that I was a little bit. I said, "Well, we need to stop this." He said, "No, I am not gonna fucking die until I finish this book." He did. The book came out in January. He died in February.
I see there are no major female characters. Is that the lack of the archives on that? Because
yes.
If you want to identify the story, you are missing like half of the population.
That's a great point. The reason why there were no women in those camps that we're talking about.
Yeah, but like mother, Hans' mother.
Because she has Hans' mother had is mentioned in the books because she was part of the early Spanish Revolution in the in the 30s. So we had a story. We had a section, 2 pages about her, and we had about 10 pages about the Quakers, women Quakers in Germany. But unfortunately, the publishers asked us to take a lot of those sections. So I'm still thinking about publishing them separately. So Najib even have at some point, this is where you get to work with artists sometimes, you take it or leave it. So I have to convince him to go with this because he just like what you mentioned, he said, we need to have all of these sections, but they thought that with the first section we have, it was about 70 pages on Europe and about 20, 30 or 35 pages on the camps. And they said there is no balance. And then a lot of people have already done work on Europe, including, so even when I was looking for a publisher in France, with that final product, they didn't want to publish because they said, well, we know the majority of it. But they said, well, it's not something. So I hear you, I hear your critique, but I as far as because we don't focus on.
It doesn't show the main characters.
Yeah. It's on purpose because this is a graphic history about labor camps,
Mhm.
and there were no women in labor. There were no. So if you're right, if we had to do one on, okay, if we included Sidla Yeshi, you're right. You have to have women there because there are families. You have to have Rabb, old people, children. That's the only camp where you had children in. So we opted not to because the other thing we didn't have time. He was dying. So we had to get what we have to get. Yeah. But it's a relevant, it's a good question that I was thinking about. I'm still thinking about it.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Aomar. First of all, not surprising, we're talking so fascinating and refreshing very many issues of memorization, as I know your work. On your research journey, I was wondering if you have been tackling documents that had to do with the locals receiving situation at the time. That is, are there any documents that show us, on the one hand, actions of righteousness of the nations, for example, trying to help the prisoners on the one hand, and on the other, cooperation with camp managers and so on. Do you think there are documents I'm asking this question in the context of memorization, the issue of project memorization?
That's a great question. The reason why this is something I've been thinking about with Sarah Stein, or this is why we had to do this book, as you know. So we have oral histories. I was able to collect a lot of oral histories. And actually, based on that, I'm doing right now a project where I'm looking at some of these camps and then interviewing or asking people their memories of the camps during the war. These are the people who are of the age that they could still remember some of those. And now, and we don't have very few, mostly in Morocco. I wish we could have we could do this work also in Algeria, but for different reasons we can't. So we don't have a lot of written sources about this. That's the really the sad thing is that we don't have a lot of for as I mentioned, as part of it was the colonial administrators, the Vichy colonial administrators were seriously thinking about this notion of erasure constantly. There was in the writings, you could say, you leave no trace, you leave no trace, you leave no trace. So I have actually documents that talk about this process. The indigenous, even in the work that Susan Miller has done in her book on Nelly Ben Attar, she talks about how people remember she interviewed people who had some memories of this. But people talk about Nsara or Lalman or he used the detail. The detail and the description of what happened, all these things, we don't have that much, including strong memory of the place. He worked there. He was a a male person. He was Raqqas. He used to take letters from his village through those sites to Marrakesh and to Telwet, the work that Orit works on with Glawi. He had interesting details, but not informed in many ways. Not informed about why Germans were there, why Polish workers were in the south, in southern Morocco, why sometimes even later on, why did we have a lot of Germans who were prisoners in what is that after the war, after Operation Torch. So, and that has to do with how much people were informed. In that part, it depends on what region. So, and I think that's, unfortunately, that's what post-independent historiography and history in many of these countries didn't do, is that for their own reasons, they were interested in other forms of writing, and historical writing, nationalist, pan-Arab, pan-Islamic, and Jews as and minorities as a category didn't fit that. Yeah.
Thank you for this fascinating. I was thinking while you were listening to you about the first time that I encountered a similar book like the form, like this or history, which is a liberal get Pina and the Important Man. So I was thinking, well, this book, the other book, I actually used it for teaching on course on law and colonialism.
Yeah.
And what I like about it is that it had the dialogues and also had this section of about documents.
Yeah.
Maybe it's, I don't know if it's like, maybe it's better to put it inside and not separately, but it also had like some kind of background, sort of background.
Yeah.
And so it's what actually, the only thing that kind of makes me wonder about it, how it is done, but actually thinking of doing something like that in the future, is how do you write dialogues in a way that is not, I mean, dialogues are not in the document, right?
Yeah.
You invent
the
and
dialogues.
of course, historians invent a lot of something like no, it doesn't.
Not him.
I mean, it's kind of, you have to use your imagination to kind of go through the feeling that, but you always say something like, when I do that, for example, I'll say maybe, or we can presume, or we can see. I say something to make sure that everyone knows that this is something that I think it might have been like that, but I don't have any kind of documentation to show it. It just kind of makes sense. But when you do this, you cannot do it. You cannot write a distance. Maybe he said that, right? So I wondered if you can say something about how you kind of deal with the issue.
That's the thing that I learned from Najib. That's what I learned from. That's where the artist helps the historian do exactly what you discussed. So sometimes I had some of the exactly the same issues. So I write, maybe by drawing it, just by you let the drawing capture exactly those issues and problems we had. And what we had, I was thinking about doing the same thing. I was thinking about having the dialogue and then adding something at the end, like a glossary and the context. So we actually talked for almost 6 or 7 months about why not doing that is the way we should go. So and so basically we decided to include everything in the text instead of separating. So we have one text. Then we talked about my role as the anthropologist sitting in the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum library, and then so we had about 7 pages actually going through, and then we talked. It's just too many narratives and too many things. So one way to do that, I think there are great courses to teach you how to write script. I was very lucky because I did that for my undergraduate studies. I was majoring in direction script writing. So I did that in theater. I worked for Paramount Picture for a year. So it helped me. And then I did a lot of work for Disney Animation. I'm actually working now, working for Disney Animation for a big project that they are doing something similar to this. So I had a background in theater but anthropology and this is for undergraduate students here. I think you'd say, well, social sciences, I know institutions these days are all about STEM, about the humanities and social sciences are just the last thing that they're thinking about. I think institutions are really making a big mistake. I think you can do a lot of things with when I was in Morocco working for Paramount Pictures, they're making a lot of money, but not interested. Because I think the humanities and social sciences are really what can make us as communities and as people humanize each other. And unfortunately, the institutions, sorry, I hope I'm not saying something that I have some deans out here. I think yeah. But I think the humanities are really what puts nations and the world on the right path of doing right by your neighbor. I think that's why, and anthropology and history and all of these things help us. And we could have careers using those to not only to put food on the table for families you plan to have or not plan to have, but that I think going back to your point, there's so many things we could do as historians, as anthropologists in projects of collaboration, and also in individual projects. And Najib guided me through that. I learned so much from that. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Sorry, I can't. Yeah, go ahead. Let me
talk about those camps.
Yes.
More as a colonial.
Yes.
But you also talk about the fact that it was Germans. If we're excluding the fact that it happened when World War II happened, what's the difference between those camps in previous to the war, and if we're talking about only as a colonial story, then in wartime with the German, there is a difference, they remain the same.
That's
but
very
the impact of the Germans, if we're excluding the fact that in the war you could recruit Jews more easily.
That's a great question. So my answer to your great question is that so these camps supposedly you can get out of the camp, you can come back to the camp, you're paid. Okay, you're paid 2 cents or 3 cents for, and then so there are some things that are different in terms of quote unquote your freedom to be locked in and to go out. That's the only difference. The other difference why it's a colonial project. It's still, these are camps that are still instituted by the Ministry of Industrial Production, the Vichy ministry, run from Algeria, Département d'Alger, but it oversees all of the other camps in Morocco and Algeria. You do have some locals in the early period before the Vichy, because as I said, there was a need for labor. Later on, you start seeing a limitation of the local. You don't see a lot of locals anymore. You don't see a lot of Jews, North African Jews. You see a few Jews in Camp Bedou, in camp also in the camp of Boudnib, a few Moroccan Jews, 1 or 2 in Boudnib, and then the rest is
probably there were Freemasons or communists.
Yeah, and I think you don't have a lot of you don't see a lot of North African. You don't see North African Jews, but you do see a lot of Spanish Republicans and European Jews. Yeah, that's the reason why I still think it's different from the camps that are all over Europe. Now, you're asking another interesting question about in this colonial project of France, what would happen if Operation Torch didn't take place? That's a very relevant question. And there was the element of people are taking names, taking property. There were some elements already happening. We have some surviving documents from Essaouira, for instance. A lot of other documents were burned.
according to even people I interviewed from the leadership of the Moroccan Jewish community, like Serge Berger. So there is the plan. The German are there. The German consulate in Casablanca was very, very active. The number of operators, German operators, would increase from 1940 for about a dozen to more than 200 or 300 operators all over the country, in Marrakesh, in Casablanca, in Fez, in Rabat. So it was real. Operation Torch changes the plan, I think. And this is where you get, this is what I think you want a Moroccan, an Algerian, Tunisian, who is Jewish or not Jewish, to read this, to read the implications of wars. You look at Ukraine, for instance. It's the wars are, unfortunately, as humans, we don't learn from wars, but wars are real. They change lives. They destroy families. They separate people. They create a lot of pain and all of these things. And I think that's why I think I still stress the collaborative project that is done through research, institutions, but then it gets out of the walls of the universities to go to public schools. I don't lead. I would love to hear from this side of the student, unless you don't like me and you don't want me to be here.
Thank you for the conference. You tell us how the story is beginning. Maybe you can tell us also about the way you finish the story. The novel is ending.
Wow.
And what were the alternatives?
That's great. That's great. So that's good. And it actually goes with your question too, but we had to do a lot of editing. We were forced to do it because of time. So when I wrote the first script, I had Hans ended up in Buenos Aires, becomes a Zionist. Then he debates whether he goes back. He comes back. He's part of his family, comes to Israel. He decides whether he goes back or not. So there's a whole conversation about it. When Najib and I sat down and started talking about this, we opted to end it at Operation Torch for the simple reason that we're thinking about time. And then, so you have to have a sequel. We're thinking about having two sections. What happened during, because it's a war story or it's a post-war story. So is it about memory of the war or post-memory? So all of these conversations, we just made the decision to end it there. We could be wrong, but not for any political reason. We had the script not because of Israeli-Palestinian conflict, not because of that. I think we just had to make sure that we finish first the first section, and then I told them, well, would you come? Let's say if you feel better, if you're doing well, would you? So we'll think about on the. He always goes out. This is his signature word, on the. So that's it. It's a great question. So, and it's still something that I don't know. I'm working now on another comic with the Senegalese artist about a Senegalese child in my village. Yeah, who end up. So a lot of Senegalese. Some of them end up going back to Senegal and Guinea and all. Some of them stay. So this family, they have actually based on their archive, the families. And so it's finding the reason why I'm saying this, it's finding the right person if you find the right artist, I'll probably do a sequel that would do justice to what Najib did. Hopefully, if I'm still alive.
So thank you so much. I'm sure we have many more questions, but we are out of time. So I really would like to thank you for this fascinating lecture. And please, you're all welcome to join us again at 2:30 here for the roundtable. Yes, but we have like an opening, yeah, a greeting. יש אני אשאר עם מה? אבל בסהרן שאפשר כלומר, יש שפת צהריים. בסדר?
Wait, c'est le dernier. Je tourne dimanche. Demain. No, it's a good question. No, it's a good question. It's a very, very good question. It's a, and as I said, it's really, it was all. We just
Him for a week here. Is there a time that it depends if it overlaps with your plastic job? Yes, because I was reading stories of women in Warsaw Ghetto. So it's like we discovered the experience.
It's
Yeah, I know. Hope I didn't. This